The good old clap, take one.
That's right.
How many of you knew what you wanted to be when you were 7 years old? I did. I wanted to be a world champion.
Hey, is there honesty involved in this podcast? Can we be honest?
You can shut your fucking lips.
And then I'll just say, put them up, what? Let's go.
He's like, you look too pretty on the wave. Get ugly.
We can talk about DMT if you want.
I thought you were boxing.
The Meg Bernardo on the lineup. Thanks for joining us today, Meg.
Oh, thank you, Dave, for asking me. I'm very honored, excited, and as I've told you, nervous.
I had to ask you multiple times. We've had world champions, big wave icons, founders. Everyone's quick to join, and you were like, "Oh, I don't know if people want to hear from me." And I'm like, "Please."
Because you just named off a whole group that I definitely don't feel like I belong. So thank you so much.
Of course not. They're nobodies. We're talking to you now.
Oh man.
Well, how are you doing today? Where are you today, and who are you with?
So I am doing really good today. It's a great day. I am in Huntington Beach, and I'm in my, I guess what they call now a she shed. It's a little like 8x8 tough shed that I converted into an office probably almost 18 months ago. And so I got in here, cleaned out all the garden stuff, painted up the walls, got my desk in here, and I have a little TV so I can watch the webcast, watch the events as they're happening, and it's nice and quiet. So
I've got a similar setup here where it's in the garage, and I like it because it's like the house is for living, and then I go in here to do the work, where I think that, and I imagine it's the same for you over the course of our careers, where it's like the personal and professional get so blurred, probably because of technology too, where I'm like, no, if I'm in the kitchen, I want to be eating as opposed to like on my computer. And
nobody wants to hear me talking and carrying on business in the kitchen either. So,
that's right.
And it's also nice because I actually have to walk outside of the house into the backyard, so you're getting out and getting dressed and kind of feeling like you're going somewhere.
I'm going to put pants on today. Yeah.
Right. So usually we have a little dog, and Joey. And so he'll come out and he'll join me for a couple hours during the day and sit in the chair and then wanders off. So, he kind of gives me my little breaks during the day.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, last week we had Ian Cairns on the podcast, and in one of my finer planning moments before we had him on, I thought, okay, I'm gonna finally convince Meg to come on the following week because her story will course correct any of Kanga's bullshit that comes out on the podcast. I'm kidding, of course, but related, actually, this worked out really well because in the conversation with Kanga, he did highlight the fact that within the sport of surfing, and these are his quotes, there's a lot of unrecognized hardworking people, and that nothing would even happen without these people. And these are people who have given their lives to the success of competitive surfing around the world. And he naturally listed you as one of those people, and I love that.
Wow, yeah, that's nice. And yes, we go way back. So I'm here today because of Ian and PT. So
well, I do want to get to that, but before we get to where you started at the then ASP, for listeners that are unfamiliar, Meg, can you outline your current role at the WSL and what the day-to-day like is in that role?
Sure. So I am considered the WSL North American Regional Manager. So
fits on a business card, I'm sure.
Yes. So as that, the WSL has various regions that oversee like the QS, juniors, and those competition levels. So for North America, our territory is Canada through Panama. And then, of course, like Puerto Rico, we take Barbados. We split up some of that Caribbean, like with the European office. Martinique, for instance, is considered under the European sanctioning jurisdiction. we have some interest from the Dominican Republic, coming our way, and just Jamaica, different places like that. So we have quite a big territory. And with that, surfers that are living in those countries, and Hawaii, of course, is its own region. So we're mainland U.S. But then the surfers sign up, they register under a particular region. So anybody living in those places would be North America. And then they fall under our like regional rankings, and kind of can come to us with any problems, their entries, and we get. You've been in the
all
office
sorts
with
of problems.
We've worked together, so you kind of know that whole span of just about anything that we get thrown at us. But basically, we're more of a sanctioning office. There are some like Hawaii that does a lot of production of their events, but most of our events are licensed out. So we work with those licensees, those contest directors, some of the sponsors, and just try to put together a QS tour.
And you mentioned that I have worked in that office, but you hired me back in 2006, I think it was.
2006, probably, yeah.
5 or 6 is all blurry for me, but
Yeah.
I remember I was still working at the surf shop, and I was freelancing for Surfing Magazine, and then I took a unpaid telecommute media internship for Melissa Buckley at what was then ASP International, and I was like, this will be good on the resume, and then she's like, well, hey, we're going to create this position at ASP North America, and you have to interview, but like Meg's great, and you'll get along. And I remember going in for the interview, and I don't remember if you remember it or what you thought of me, but I was very like impressed, and I was excited.
Yeah, no, it was great. And in fact, I'm thinking we were probably over on Florida Street in Huntington Beach, like off of Main Street, maybe?
I don't think so. We were still in the surf line. We were in the surf line office at that time.
Okay.
Because I remember it was just you. We had the 2 offices, and we had you and Rachel Harris. And then I was getting hired at a weird time when I can't remember what the other gentleman's name, but Chad Hochter, and I think the other guy's name was Nick, were on the way out. But then there was this weird, they're like, are you replacing us? And I'm like, I don't think so. And then Chad was like, I know the governor, and I walk around with a gun. And I was like, this is great.
Yeah. Okay. So that's funny that you bring that up. So we had transitioned out of our relationship with Surfing America.
That's right.
Right.
And Surfing America, for everyone out there, it's the ISA sort of amateur organization in surfing in the USA.
They're recognized as the national governing body for, and if you speak to Fernando, there really is no distinction between amateur and pro, right? But
lot of blurred lines with that gentleman.
For our purposes, we still say, you're either winning money or you're not. You're surfing for trophies or for whatever, right? So I was down at a U.S. Open talking to Sean Collins and Lane Beachley, just up in the area. We're chatting away, and Sean was asking me something about our office arrangements, and I told him where we were. And we had just recently taken the ASP regional license back to ASP International. And so with that, we were saying, this is probably a good idea if we're looking for a new place, a good time to just kind of separate ourselves.
Right.
And, and Sean was like, that's interesting, So we go off our separate ways, right? And like within the week, I get a call from him, and he said, we have a couple empty spaces here. What do you think about coming in and, you can sublet from us? And I was just, because they're right there, corner of Main Street and PCH, 3rd floor, looking out at the pier. And I said, it couldn't be better, So we had quite a few years with Surfline, and that was really very generous of him to offer.
World's slowest elevator in that office building.
Yes. They have put in new elevators.
We would wait for 20 or 30 minutes just to go 3 floors.
I got caught in there one day.
Oh, no, you didn't. You were just on your way. That's how long it took.
Yes, yeah. Because seriously, it all went dark. And for like 20 minutes, I'm just standing there thinking, oh, I'm never going to get out of this. It's just horrifying,
This is how it ends. There was all the signals. I knew this is my fault.
Yeah.
Well, let's go back to how you got started. Where were you born and raised? Was it Huntington Beach, or did you move there?
No. So I was born and raised in Broadview Heights, Ohio, which is just outside of Cleveland. And in a pretty, well, to give you an example, we had like 3 acres of property with all the back was woods that backed up to neighbors that had like 22 acres and somebody that had a lake on the other side. And I had a horse and we had, all these things, ducks and all this stuff. And so that was kind of my upbringing. It wasn't like hick or anything, but it was definitely open space and just very being involved with nature and outside and everything. Yeah.
And when did you guys move to Huntington Beach, and for what reason?
So my 2 sisters are much older than me, and my aunt was out here in California. And both of my sisters, when they turned 18, moved out to California. So I was about I had just turned 13, and my parents were saying, we really want to get to California. That's where our family is. My parents had been out here in the 50s. My dad was a truck driver, and he was able to get a transfer with the company. And so everything just sort of aligned. So we came out here with my grandmother. And so the 4 of us moved to Huntington Beach.
And I presume the horse didn't make it out with you, but was that like a bridge for you to be like, well, all right, Dad, I'm going to take up surfing then?
Yeah. Well, coming here again at 13, beginning of summer, like literally I got out of 7th grade and the next day the Ryder truck was filled up in the driveway and we hit the road. And we got here and the dog that we brought immediately ran away. We never found him. Never showed up at the pound or anything.
Went back to Ohio.
Yeah, probably. And I had to, at that age, coming into a whole new place and trying to make friends was really difficult. You'd think you'd be really excited to move to California. And I was just not excited at all because I was thinking, this is hard, Yeah. So for me, I really liked going to the beach, because we live in a tract homing area, with it's your house and it's the walls. And so going to the
Looks
beach.
Looks like the next house.
Exactly. So going to the beach was just a great escape because there's no boundaries. It's wide open. It's fresh air. And so, going there all the time and seeing people surfing, guys mainly at that time. There weren't quite many girls out there, but I just really wanted to do that. So
it's funny because I there's a lot of parallels. Like I grew up in suburban Orange County mostly, but that was a huge draw for me too, where I'm like, oh, this is not, the beach and the ocean are not curated, or there's not really guardrails. This is exciting. This is like just something just more interesting than where I came from.
Right. Yeah. And my mom really loved the ocean, but she wasn't a good swimmer. So that whole, whereas my dad really, he loved swimming. We always stopped it when we'd come across country, even in the summer times, to visit my sisters. 4:00, you check into the Howard Johnson that has the pool and you go swimming. That was kind of your reward for the long day on the road. But my mom wasn't really comfortable with that. So she was very instrumental in getting me on the right path.
And this would have been, so I'm guessing like 1970s, 1980s, and you enrolled in Huntington Beach High School. Is that right?
Yep. Right. So, so it was like 78, 79.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you've been sort of a scion of that community ever since. Like what are sort of the huge changes between that time in Huntington and now from your perspective, and what's maybe one or two things that have like remained the same the whole time?
Main Street, big change. Main Street still kind of the same. I mean, in terms of when I was growing up down there, it was primarily, like your surf shops, and there were apartment buildings that people, lived above in there, and just really community feeling, And now, of course, they've redone everything, and you've got 4 levels of retail and offices. Right. So that part of it, and restaurants, the surf shops now have kind of gone off onto the side streets, or or just disappeared, really.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because it's really interesting. I was having a conversation with Pat O'Connell the other day, and we were just bullshitting about something, but we were talking about the cultural value and identity of Orange County, and how it in a huge way, like globally, what people's perspective could be and is in some respects is surf culture, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the industry. But it's this funny thing where, we were talking about the Paskowitz family, and we were talking about, God, I can't remember the name, but just a couple of, which probably proves my point for me, couple of like major heavy hitters from like the 70s and 80s in the surfing world who have been completely disconnected. And I say, it's just one of those things where it's like, the industry didn't really take those people or those surf shops or those board builders and integrate them into the mainstream success in a way that would have retained that connective tissue, right? When you're kind of presenting Orange County to the world. And in a lot of ways, it's like those people who inspired the people who built the surf industry probably can't afford to live in Orange County anymore, or run their surf shop, which is sad in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is we'd go to the beach during the summer, and during the day, at some point, you'd always go up onto Main Street, and you'd check in at either, Sunline surfboards or Carl Hayward surfboards, because somebody you knew was working, and you'd just go and hang out, or you'd, just go spend some time, and then you'd head back down to the beach and, go for a swim and that sort of stuff. And it was just very, I don't know. I don't really see that now downtown so much. It is geared toward, say, the tourist.
Right. It's funny though, because the tourists are there because they want the sort of, it's come full circle, right? They want the authentic surfing experience. It's like, hey, you could have kept everyone around. It would have been better for everybody.
Right.
You mentioned when you were getting into surfing, there weren't a lot of women who did it. Was that, I'm wondering, two things. Did that ever intimidate you? And then second question was, do you think that if it didn't, or even if it did and you persevered, did the fact that you came from Ohio and had a bit of an outsider's perspective help you kind of get through that?
Yeah, I'd say it definitely. I was intimidated, because you'd kind of find a break that was very uncrowded. You'd paddle out, and by the time you got there, you're usually surrounded by a bunch of guys just hassling.
Sure.
And I was never any good, believe me. You know what I mean? I could just get myself out there, and actually that's where my mom came in to play, because she saw an ad in the Register for surf classes that were being offered down in Newport, and she said to me, "Yeah, it's these couple guys. Do you know who they are? It's Peter Townend and Ian Cairns." And I was just like, "Wait, what? What did you say?" And I ran upstairs, and I got, my surfer and my surfing magazines, because I used to, beg her for money to get both of those, and clip out, have stuff all over my closet doors and stuff. And I showed her, PT at the time, I think, was rated number 1 in the surfer poll. And Ian would have been right up there too, because they were up there in the top 5 of the ratings at the time, at the IPS ratings. And I said, "This is them, Mom. That's them," And so she called up 2 of my girlfriend's parents and said, "Look, I'm going to put Meg in this class. Will you, put your girls in? And they said, yeah. So my
That's
two
awesome.
friends, yeah, Julie, Kim, and I went in, and then PT and Ian brought in Carl Hayward, who had his shop
Yep.
right down there on Main Street to come in for the week that we had this surf class and go out and, surf with us and all that. So it was really fantastic. It was unbelievable.
Were there other girls that did the class with you, or were you the only three?
Yeah, no, there were a couple other girls. And in fact, even Alyssa Schwartzstein and her dad had, paddled out with us because Alyssa, was actually surfing and competing on NSSA rankings and events and stuff. And so PT and Ian were very good about inviting people to come in and to speak to the group, whether it was about marine safety or Jericho Poplar came in one day. And of course she was, a known pro woman. And so it was really a nice, they had it dialed in. Exactly.
Yeah, this sounds like an amazing school. So PT and Kanga were actually there, and they had like coursework and instruction and everything in between them, competing for world titles. Yeah.
So, you'd spend a little bit of time with them going over that stuff with you, and then you'd go out to the water, and they set up for us to go over, and Carl shaped a board and kind of told us all about board building. And so it was really good.
So you meet PT and Kanga then, which I think you said is 1980. And then, if I'm correct, 2 years later, you started working for them at at Sports and Media Services, their marketing company.
Yeah.
How old were you then, and how did that job come about between the surf school and taking it?
Yeah. So I used to volunteer for just about any surf thing that was in town. So we had the Caton, and one of the guys on our team, George Lambert, his dad knew Nancy Caton. He was the contest director. So, it's like, oh, George, I want to work at the, Caton. And of course it was all volunteer, right? So I think at that I was what you called a scribe, where you sat at the feet of the judges, and they'd call their scores down, and, you'd mark them down for them. And of course, PT and Ian were around all of these events, and they were involved with the NSSA. And so our shop, one of the shop teachers at Huntington was also the surf coach, Rob Hill. And so my sophomore year, I went up to Rob and I said, hey, do you need anybody to keep score, tabulate, do anything, And, he said, yeah, absolutely. So in that, I kind of just kept running into PT and Ian's wife, Pat, and they were doing Sports and Media Services and the NSSA. And so they said, oh, well, we could use some help. So after school, because they lived downtown on California Street, Pat and Ian, I'd go in after school and we'd sit on the front lawn and fold newsletters or stuff envelopes for memberships or just whatever. I'd answer phones. And so my senior year, which was 82, I really had all my credits, and I had extra credits and all this. So I was getting out of school by like noon. And they said, so would you actually like to get paid for this? I said, really?
You're like, I'm not getting paid. What do you mean?
I said, yeah, I would love it. That would be fantastic. So yeah, so that's how I fell into the job.
Well, and that's a really interesting time too, right? Because in 82, 83, Kanga was, as the bards tell it, organizing his surfer-led coup to transition, the global sport from the IPS to the ASP. Were you getting exposed to any of that working with him?
Well, yeah, for sure, because it was Ian, PT, Pat, and me. So, and they decided to get an office. So our first office was on Gothard and Warner in Huntington Beach. And they actually wound up moving into a condo right up there too. So so then we were kind of in this office position, and that's when Ian was pitching the idea of the OP Pro. So,
Yep.
and I haven't had a chance to listen to Ian's podcast, so I don't know.
Tell the truth, Meg. Tell us what really
happened. This is coming from my perspective and what I was seeing.
Yeah, of course.
And,
it's good disclaimer.
Happened.
It's good, yeah.
Right, yeah. But anyway, and PT was doing a lot with Surfing Magazine at the time. So, but we were also producing different events, and I think like it became like the Hang 10 series and Tropics and different things. So there, and the NSSA. So there's already this foundation of events, event structure and all of that. So yeah, so Ian pitched the idea of this event that OP took on. And so 82 was the first OP Pro.
Right.
And yeah, so I got
what timing for you?
Yeah, right. So obviously then I was put to work, I was running the scores, getting them from the judges and bringing them down for tabulation so that they could announce them right away to the announcers, which was kind of a new thing.
Right. Yeah. And that role evolved into a few years later. You did become operations director for the ASP, and you were effectively running the tour out of Huntington Beach. Is that right?
Yeah.
86?
86. So
yeah.
So Ian resigned in 86 and went back to Australia. And then that's when Graham Cassidy, Sid, was put in as executive director, and he was in Australia and still, a journalist and editor, right, for the Sydney Morning Herald.
Sure.
And he had Jill Hummelstead was working for him. So basically, the office had, in a sense, moved to Australia because, as the executive director, he was there. And we were really kind of closing up operations. NSSA, the director then was Carolyn Adams, who came from Texas. So these kind of elements of what fell underneath the Sports and Media Services umbrella were being kind of dispersed. And I got a call from Peter Burness, who was the president of ASP from South Africa. And he says, what would you think about keeping an office open there? And, you working with Sid and Jill. And, we kind of have a foothold now in the United States or in West Coast at least. And so we kind of like to keep that momentum going. And I think Al was even coming through. Al Hunt was coming through at the time, and he talked to me about it. And, he said, it makes sense. And I said, yeah, I really don't want to go anywhere. I'd like to stay. So
we've all been seduced by Al Hunt at one point or another. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So for a long time, we still shared the office with the NSSA.
Right.
And in that time, we had hired Dory Payne. And, the workload was huge because you had Al, who was actually traveling around and going to events as a tour manager. And, you had Sid and Jill handling things in Australia, and you had your head judge, who maybe was Fuchsie at the time. And, but actually as administrative office staff, there was like 3 people. And
that's what always shocked me. Like even when I took the internship, I'm like, it's a global company. I'll be conservative. There's probably like a couple hundred people that work there, and then there's like 5. You're
right.
You're like, wait, what? Like, how much work are we supposed to do here?
Yeah,
it's like a few of us doing it. It must have been pretty Wild West in those days too, just sort of like running and gunning and being on tour. And I mean, this came up a little bit with Ian Cairns, and it's come up with Randy and Bugs and everyone, where it's like, you're speaking something into being, kind of the sport of professional surfing, and you're cleaving your way into a business that didn't exist before. And so you're really pushing it in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, it was, we kind of pirated Dory away from the NSSA.
And standard practice.
Yeah. And we really, worked very well together. So,
yeah.
So that was, some really groundbreaking times, I guess, because things were always changing. You'd go to meetings.
Still feels that way, right?
Yeah. But you'd go to a board meeting and you knew that there was going to be 100 rule changes coming into play. And, from year to year, you didn't know if an event didn't come back on the tour, there was no money. It was just, yeah.
So a lot of, and even it's funny, right? Because that's been my experience for 15 years too. And I think something we're all, I guess, sort of my responsibility. So if I don't do it, I'm in trouble. But like kind of removing that tail wagging the dog of like, we need an event, we'll do whatever, we'll kind of Frankenstein the whole thing together, to like, we're going to be really deliberate about what this is and institutionalize, like, this event's going to be here hopefully forever. This is how we're going to crown world champs hopefully forever. And it's how we're going to qualify people. And I can only imagine what it was like in the 80s and 90s, because it would have been even more kind of like foundation building in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And it's funny because really, like, within that first, say, 10 years of ASP, we were growing so fast. So many surfers were wanting to get into events, and we were getting a lot of events on the tour. And I remember Dory even saying then, she goes, man, wouldn't it be great if just somebody had a lot of money and just came in and took this all over, and we could actually work under kind of a specific, guidelines.
Direction,
direction, instead of kind of thinking, oh, the next board meeting's coming up, I wonder what this is going to mean,
That's right.
So.
Well, it's funny too, right? Because, and it's one of those things that in my exposure to it has been a real challenge, which is that, like, surfing means different things in different countries, right? So like in Australia, you've got the government like bidding to bring events to their different beaches. They're paying and they're competing against each other because it's more of an established mainstream sport. And then, in the US, it's not so much the opposite, but that doesn't happen, where you're like, hey, look, you're having to kind of campaign to bring an event to this beach because of all these advantages. But then that one through line of, whether it's Rabbit's conception of the dream tour or just the idea of like, we're going to get the best surfers we can find and put them in the best waves we can find, and we're going to create the conditions for something special, is so potent that you do get tens of thousands of kids around the world. They're like, I got to get into the event.
Yeah.
I got to do this. And behind the scenes, we're all going, that's great. We really need to stabilize this, because it's like we can't accommodate everybody. Yeah. We can't accommodate the demand.
Yeah. Even now, depending on where an event is located, Huntington Beach, for example, we've got like the Jax Pro, which is a QS 1000, but 2019, because we didn't have it last year,
right?
We had probably 50 alternates,
right?
So yeah, definitely there's a demand.
So through the 90s and early aughties, can you walk us through, I know there's so many changes to the organization, but just your role in particular and how that evolved? And maybe it didn't, maybe it kind of stayed constant throughout, but what were kind of some of the drum beats for you through the 90s and early aughties?
Yeah, so I think as we kind of, did hire on a couple more people, and there were the regional offices really started to get some substance. It started out more as regional reps, and then we actually had offices. There was a period of time when I handled the banquet, along with other things. That was like a really big part, because that took months to organize when we were finishing in Hawaii. So, I'd go over, say, for November, December, and it was like from top to bottom, putting out invitations to, getting the centerpieces and helping to write the script and everything. So, it was a pretty big job. That banquet was 400 people, black tie.
Right.
So it was, there was that. And then I was kind of like special events. So maybe the specialty events too. If we had some of those, I'd sort of, my attention would be turned towards those. And as we did develop the regional offices, there was a period where that was my baby, let's say, and I helped with like the manuals for regional offices and event manuals, which in fact I did an event manual this last summer or beginning of the year, I guess. So, so kind of just wherever it seemed like we needed to go.
Right.
Or I kind of just morphed into that, maybe because I had been around for a while. So it was easier for me to kind of step in and start that process.
Well, it's interesting you say that too, because I feel like I've experienced it probably like a fraction of what you have too, which it is such a specialized sport, culture, community business that time and experience really makes you like a very valuable generalist in a lot of ways, where they're like, we need you to work on this, we need you to work on that, we need you to do this, because you do have that perspective, because you've sat at that kind of nexus point between a lot of different phases and a lot of different kind of parts of the company. I always really, I loved the banquet. I still do. I think we changed it. We called it the WSL Awards or whatever. But it's one of those things that at one point we're like, we're going to make this commercial, we're going to sell tickets, we're going to broadcast it, et cetera, et cetera. And it kind of moved into this like entertainment based thing where there was like music acts and all this stuff. And it was interesting. It's cool. But my favorite part about it was kind of what you said, where it's like the singular night of the year where you take literally the best surfers on the planet and you put them all in one place and you put them in black ties. And it's almost, there's an air of like sacredness to it because, and I kind of think it's my personal opinion. I don't get everything I want at the company, but like I always liked not having the other things, not having the webcast, not having the entertainment, unless it was kind of private, because it is kind of a special thing. And there's sort of an exclusiveness to it that makes it cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Those were a lot of fun. And I have some photo albums that I go back through and I look at, and it's funny because my first trip to Australia, Sid brought me over because we were going to be transferring from Australia to Hawaii. And so, he said, this is going to kind of be your job now. So I attended the banquet, kind of, got to see what their goal was and what their vision of it would be, and, make it happen in Hawaii. So,
one of the things that I will always be indebted to you for is that, same as what I just kind of talked about, is that it's such a specialized, unique community, and it can feel exclusive just because there's so much history and background between different entities and surfers and brands and events and organizers and et cetera. You were just always so kind and giving. You were my guide in a lot of ways, where, I'd be like, I got this email from this person, and you'd be like, here's the backstory on that person. I'm like, thank you so much. I would have for sure said the wrong thing or asked for the wrong thing. And I don't know. I just feel like that was always the so much of what you do is intangibly, but also like, what's the word? Like priceless, intangibly priceless is what I'm getting at. Just because every time I come to the office, there's some mega figure from the surfing world, whether it's, Bob McKnight or like, Shane Horan or somebody's in there and kind of having tea with Meg Bernardo because they have to.
Oh. Well, thank you, Dave. That's nice. And I really had very good mentors. I mean, going back to like Pat Cairns, she just, and funny because she was a school teacher, when they were in Australia, and she just had that way about her of just making you feel comfortable and sort of teaching you the ropes on stuff. And so she really helped me to navigate my way around an office and how to deal with people. The importance of just getting back to somebody, even if you say, I don't know, just call them back, or just send them an email and say, I don't know, but I'll put you on my list.
I think telling people I don't know, but I'll work it out is the most valuable thing you can do right now, because everyone else just pretends like they do, where it's like, hey, we don't know everything.
Yeah.
One of the things you said that struck me, which I think is important for everyone listening, because I'm sure you get asked about it a lot too, where, it is a really, from the outside and also from the inside, let's be honest, a very desirable business to work in and a lifestyle. And what we do is really, really cool. I get asked all the time, like, well, how do I get in and how do I get to where you got? And which is like, I'm like, well, just look at a pinball machine and then meditate on that.
Right.
But like, what I do tell them is like, whatever you want to do, like be willing to do it for free if you're passionate about it, which is what you did, like you said, I just want to be involved. And, I did the same, I said, I just want to be involved. I'm willing to do this because I think it's important. And I think that opens up even after you start getting paid and, or whatever we get paid is it like that kind of attitude helps, and it helps open a lot of doors because you're down for the cause and you're respectful to other people and you want to hear about it.
Yeah. And that is so true because I get calls from people, I get emails asking the same thing. And they send in these resumes, that on paper are really wonderful. And they're like, what did you do? And I tell them, just go down and look down the list and see where there's a contest. You're from the East Coast, call up the ESA, see what's going on this weekend and go spend some time and help out. You will be so just amazed at the people that you meet down there, the parents, the kids that are surfing, the staff that are working, because everybody's there because they love the sport. They love the sport, they love the beach, and they will usually welcome you. They'll welcome the help for sure.
If you're volunteering, it's pretty much there's always a box to carry. I've found at surf contests.
Right.
So.
But that's how you start just meeting people, and then you start getting invited to things, and they start knowing you and saying, hey, this person, wants to help out, and it just keeps kind of rolling right along to possibly where you want to be.
Yeah. We got a couple more topics to get to, but first we're going to take a quick break to get a word in from our sponsors. When we were acquired, you mentioned before, I think we were saying we were working with Dory, where you're like, geez, it would be great to kind of consolidate everything under one umbrella someday. And that happened. At the end of 2012, we were acquired. And I was working, I don't remember what my position was at the time, international media director or something. You were heading up the North American region.
Right.
What was do you remember the first time you were exposed to the idea that we'd be acquired?
We'd kind of heard some rumblings about it. And I think it was Richard Grauman who said, hey, we're setting up this meeting. And it was at one of the hotels. Now, I can't remember if it was the Hyatt or the Hilton, but, kind of in the banquet room. Right. And kind of all the major stakeholders were invited, and surfers and, Randy Rarick and Claw and like Bob McKnight, everybody, right? And there was the presentation. Were you there?
I was at the one on the Gold Coast.
Okay.
I'm sure, actually, I'm sure I was at this one too. I just kind of dragged a lot of them.
Yeah. But there were, like Paul Speaker was there and Dirk was there, and there was a few other gentlemen that they had with them, and they each got up and sort of spoke about their involvement with surfing and their vision of how they saw things could, what direction it could go in. And it was really time. I think the brands were at a point where they couldn't really sustain the tour. Sure. And I think we were all kind of feeling this, okay, if it's going to happen, this is a great time for it to happen.
Yeah, that's how I remember it too, because I actually remember really early on, before that, when I was working on the website. This would have been, I don't know, like 2007 maybe. And we started running like Google Analytics for the website. We didn't have control of the webcast then, but we're like, well, the website, aspworldtour.com, which I still think is great, or was great. We're like, well, we'll be the hub, because at the time, of course, if you had 10 CT events, you had 10 different websites because there was no aggregated space. And we're like, well, we'll be the hub. So we kind of created that. And I started running the analytics during event windows and then giving them to my counterpart at Quicksilver or Billabong or whoever. And I vividly remember doing this with my counterpart at Quicksilver the first time. I said, hey, here's the web traffic for the Quicksilver Pro Gold Coast on aspworldtour.com. Pretty good. And next year we'll look at it and see if we did better or worse. And my counterpart looked at me and went, this is great. My boss does not give a shit at all. Like there's no P&L, there's no ROI. All we talk about at Quicksilver is let's do whatever Billabong did and then do that plus this. And there was this as kind of irresponsible, it's good for the fans, I guess, proliferation of service because everyone was doing so well. But as you said, global financial crisis of 2008, a lot of those brands then had to take a hard look at what they were spending their money on. And the tour at that point was unsustainable.
Yeah.
And I remember we had Brody was our CEO. He was our CEO when I started in 2005, 6. And then he left in 2011. And then 2012, we had the management committee. We didn't have a CEO. It was just sort of three tiger sharks that were eating each other constantly. As a story for another time.
I was in the North America, my little world, my region, so I didn't.
This is a nice aquarium. That was the other aquarium sucked. No, it was fine. I kid. It was all funny. But I do remember going to that meeting. I think the first meeting I went to was on the Gold Coast, and we got the same presentation. And it was interesting, right? Because the ownership structure of the sport before then was under the ASP model, which was owned 50% by the surfers and then 50% by the event licensees. And the event licensees were basically exclusively endemic brands who more often than not also sponsored the representatives on the surfer side. So that's another conflict of interest we can go down another time. Yeah. But I remember, this is a bit of a funny story, having the Trestles event in 2012, and we were on site. And for whatever reason, the little box that Renato Hickel and I were working in was so narrow. It would have been about 2 feet wide and like 8 feet deep.
Yeah.
And Renato called me on the phone and he's like, hey, Terry Hardy and Natasha Ziff and Paul Speaker want to talk to you and I. And I'm like, okay. And so I come in and we're sitting in the closest we can make a circle in like our little crappy folding chairs, but it was so narrow that all of our knees were touching each other.
It's gotta be so awkward.
And Paul went into this pitch, which I'd heard. And the funny thing is like all the things they wanted to do were things we've been saying needed to happen for a long time.
Yes,
like aggregate everything under an umbrella, like blah, blah, blah. And so, Paul could talk and he was like talking for like 20 minutes and then he's like, oh, geez, I've been talking too much. Like, what do you guys think? And like Renato looked at me and I looked at him and he's like, well, what do you think, Dave? And I said, look, all that sounds great. We don't have any influence. Like we'll say, I hope you get it, and I hope you get it, and I hope you keep us around. But like, what you want to do, right on, man. Like we're into it. But that's how I remember it happening.
True, right? Yeah, I can totally see that happening because it's true, right?
Look at us. Like we survived.
Yeah.
Well, and it was interesting, right? Because a lot of the things they did right away were like immediate improvements. We're like, hey, we're standardizing all the webcasts and we're doing all these things. And it's been really, really interesting in that I think it allowed us to test a bunch of different things, right? Where we go, okay, we're going to go out and we'll work with the big wave community, or we're going to, acquire the Kelly Slater Wave Company, or we'll develop an ocean health advocacy program. All these really rad things that are kind of built on top of that engine of the sport. But that to me feels like it's the through line, is that people still come back because they're like, I want to see world champions, And I think if anything, the pandemic's really helped us refocus back in on that, and making sure that how we do that and that framework is, as exciting as possible and also as stable as possible.
Yeah, definitely. And the changes to come about are good.
Yeah, I think so. And one of those is obviously the idea of a regional QS system, which from your standpoint, I wanted to get kind of your unvarnished thoughts on. The idea being, for listeners, that moving forward in 22 and beyond, we'll have our championship tour that will determine the top 5 who qualify for the WSL finals, where we'll determine our world champs. There'll be an intermediary tier called the Challenger Series that will be a collective of surfers from all of our 7 regions who compete across 8 events for a spot on the following season's championship tour. And then to get to the Challenger Series, we've regionalized the QS, meaning that if you're a North American surfer, you can compete close to home and surf on hopefully a very strong domestic tour. And same if you're an Australian, you can compete on your own domestic tour, and Brazilian, et cetera, and kind of build up your competitive chops and your seeding before you get to the Challenger Series, which will be an international tour. So based on your background and experience, I wanted to get your thoughts on what you think of that change for the region.
Yeah. I definitely think that the move to a more definite 3-tier system is really good, because it makes sense, because we do have so many wanting to compete to get to the CT that you kind of have to break it up a bit,
Right.
Get a level in there. And I can't tell you how many people refer back to, do you remember the Bud Surf Tour days?
I'm glad you brought it up, because it's in my notes.
Oh, okay. But, that's referenced a lot. And for maybe the younger generation or newer listeners, they may not be familiar with that. And maybe Ian spoke about it. But, the Bud Surf Tour really brought us a United States champion. It was, easy to understand and follow. You kind of, had these points that were going around. You had Santa Cruz, you had some on the East Coast. It was just a really good model. So in a sense, we're kind of getting back to that in terms of these regional tours. And we're building, or we will be able to build, regional stars, and ones for people to get behind and follow. I think, and this is going to be another situation where things will be tweaked as we, kind of go through it, right? Like we'll get it into play, and we may see that kind of doesn't really work too good for maybe seeding or for qualification, and maybe we have to tweak it a little bit. Some of the things that we've talked about within our regions is that if you make every level, like your QS 1000, QS 3000, QS 5000, strictly for regional surfers, where is the desire for, say, a brand or a sponsor or a promoter to go to that 5,000 level if you're really going to get the same surfers that you're going to get in a 1,000?
Totally.
And so maybe you mix that up a little bit. You say a certain percentage can be international for a 3,000, a certain for 5. And then, because the other thing is those that are competing out on the tour, they need the experience of travel and surfing particular breaks. And, if you don't get out there and do it on a lower level, what happens when you get to the Challenger Series and you haven't really had that experience? You could get eaten up pretty easily.
That's a really good point. The thing that I love about it, and I love that you brought up the Bud Tour, because I think that like the Bud Tour made the momentum generation, and the Brazilian Storm came out of a very strong and stable domestic tour in Brazil. Competitive practice breeds world champs, right? And that's kind of the point. And I think you're right, and I think that if we can develop strong regional systems, that you're going to have these sort of incubation areas where people, I mean, you see it now, right? And it's an interesting problem to look at and try to solve, because it's not just the WSL. There's the industry, and there's all sorts of things that play into it. But young kids, as you put it, kind of being thrust out into the world to compete, against grown men and women on the QS, on an international system, which is sometimes really problematic.
Yeah.
I personally, I'm really looking forward to doing it, but I think you're right. There'll be some tweaks along the way as we get it up and running.
I like the idea of the finals too, because that's really exciting. I don't know how all the surfers feel about it, because if you have a shocking day,
they all love it. No.
But it's great for fans, I think, to follow that concept and see that, and
yeah, I think so too. I mentioned this when I think Ian and I were talking about it last week, and I've told this story a couple times, but like I was initially skeptical because we've been talking about this for a long time, mostly from like a legitimacy standpoint. Mm-hmm. And then we had a meeting in Fiji a few years ago during the event where we brought in the world champs and kind of the people who had been runner-up or were kind of in the mix, and talked about it. And to a person, they were like, "This sounds great." And I was personally really surprised. But then they had this interesting sort of champion psychology to the argument where they said, look, like when I win a world title, I want to do it in the water, and I want to do it against the next best person. As opposed to the system before, which was cool, but it was also a system in which you could have been in your hotel room or your locker room or whatever, and the person who was still in the running against you goes down to a wild card or a lower seed in the event, and that's it. You kind of won by default. And I thought that was really interesting. And I just like the idea of like, look, we're going to have it at a world-class wave, and you're going to have to surf against the best surfers of the season. And whoever wins is going to be in kind of this amazing position of having done that. So I think it's going to be cool too.
Yeah. Exciting summer.
Well, to close us out, we do have a few questions from the Instagram community. So I'm gonna ask these. The first question is from Chris.Fowler.187, who asks, "What's the strangest excuse a surfer has ever made for missing an event?"
Okay, seriously, I have heard my dog ate my passport, and so I missed my flight. So
that's fair.
That's a good excuse. Right? Dog ate my homework. No, dog ate my passport.
Yeah. I believe it. Okay. Next one is Kriegstagram, who asks, "What do you think of the commercialization of the WSL?"
I think it's not as bad as maybe what we thought it could be. And with anything that's going to grow, you have to, there's give and take, and I think surfing's always wanted to keep itself so core, but I think it can stay authentic and still get out there. And it's really by keeping people involved that are passionate about the sport.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the funny thing is like, I think what people might deem as like commercializing the sport is like, well, this is what pays for the sport to keep happening. So it's sort of, it's this or nothing kind of deal. And at the end of the day, it's like, it's a business. Like we want to drive revenue so we can keep creating this platform to watch world champions happen. Last question from the Instagram community. Goof_diaries asks, "Who is the best character you've ever come across in surfing?"
The best character. Oh my goodness. That's
You've come across a few.
That's such a loaded question because it's like, anyone from a surfer to somebody coming by the office or, promoter,
Sure.
Yeah,
right.
I'd say, for some reason, Brad Gerlach comes to my mind just because, he's a fantastic surfer. He always had something funny, an interesting spin or take on something, wasn't afraid to get out there and say what he wants to say. And I actually haven't talked to Brad in several years, but every time I do, he's got such a charismatic personality that, I don't know if that really falls into the question that he's asking because it's not in a bad way. It's just in a really, it's in a good way, Yeah.
Brad's going to listen to this and be like, I know some of the people that she's met. Like, well, I'm not that bad.
No, and that's what I mean, not in a bad way, but I just think of somebody that's like, just stands out as someone that, that's a character.
I love it. Well, Meg Bernardo, thank you so much for what you do. Thank you for being my professional and personal guide in a lot of ways. And thank you for being my friend. And thanks for doing this podcast.
Thank you, Dave. That makes me very glad. But I enjoy talking to you. And you really put me at ease, and I had a great time and look forward to many more good years.
Me too.
Yeah.
Thanks, Meg.
Thanks, Dave.